So I started out making something else. The stuff we're going to talk about today was just supposed to be the cold open for the biodiversity video I made a few weeks ago, but I decided this stuff was important enough to cover all on its own. Also, this video could, and probably should, be more like 2 or 3 hours long. I tried to keep it concise, but I strongly encourage everyone to check out the sources I've linked down in the video description, because this stuff is absolutely worth knowing about. In 2010, the UN General Assembly voted to designate the years between 2011 and 2020 as the Decade of Biodiversity. So basically, they gave all of us on Earth a 10-year challenge to protect and improve biodiversity. But what does that mean? Before I get into the lists of objectives, and goals, and targets, let's take a look at a map I found on the website for the Convention on Biological Diversity, the official organization for the UN's biodiversity project. As we look at this map, it's encouraging to see that apparently a lot of countries have been meeting their biodiversity targets. But there are also a lot of countries that have been struggling. And there's no data available for the US? What the fuck? The Convention on Biological Diversity was established with 3 main objectives: the conservation of biological diversity, the sustainable use of the components of biological diversity, and the fair and equitable sharing of the benefits arising out of the utilization of genetic resources. Okay, I think we can break those down pretty easily. We want to conserve biodiversity, so basically stop species extinctions and retain the levels of biodiversity we have, if not increase them. We also want to use natural resources sustainably, meaning that they will persist for continued use in the future. Okay. And then we want to... Woo! Hold on. What? The fair and equitable sharing of the benefits? That's not just anti-world poverty, that objective has a definite socialist tone to it. That's really interesting. But it makes total sense for a global plan to protect biodiversity and natural resources to have this kind of socialist vibe. I'm planning on making at least one video in the future explaining environmental racism, but for now it's enough to say that the people who have to deal with the negative effects of resource extraction are not the same ones who profit from that resource extraction. So it's nice to see the UN putting this issue front and center in their objectives. You know, 3 objectives is cute, but bureaucrats really like lists. So in addition to those 3 objectives, the Convention on Biological Diversity also has 5 strategic plan goals. Address the underlying causes of biodiversity loss by mainstreaming biodiversity across government and society, reduce the direct pressures on biodiversity and promote sustainable use, to improve the status of biodiversity by safeguarding ecosystems, species, and genetic diversity, enhance the benefits to all from biodiversity and ecosystem services, and enhance implementation through participatory planning, knowledge management, and capacity building. Those 5 goals are pretty complicated. So in addition to the list of objectives and the list of goals, the Convention on Biological Diversity also has a list of 20 targets. You may know these as the Aichi Biodiversity Targets that should help us reach those 5 goals. And those 3 objectives, 5 goals, and 20 targets are what constitute the Biodiversity 10-year challenge. I want to make sure I make something very clear. We have not failed this 10-year challenge. That's in part because a lot of people, organizations, and governments have been making progress. It's also because there is no end to this situation. The world and its environments are going to continue existing, and we're going to continue affecting them. So we haven't failed the challenge, but we also haven't made as much progress as many of us would have liked. That's because these objectives, goals, and targets have a few broad flaws in common. First, many of the goals list things that need to be done or measured, but they're vague on the details about who will be doing the things or making the measurements or evaluations. It's fine to have built the original plan with some flexibility, but if committees, inspectors, and methods of enforcement were never put in place, then it will be difficult to say if we've ever reached or completed these goals. Secondly, these goals are overwhelmingly ambitious, and I think it's to their detriment. The UN's list of biodiversity-related goals simultaneously seeks to protect biodiversity and natural resources, stop environmental racism, and promote economic growth. I love all of these things, and I think they're all important goals, but sometimes they're mutually exclusive, and the UN's list of goals doesn't do a great job of helping us prioritize. What do I mean by prioritize? Well, consider a hypothetical scenario where a company wants to extract a natural resource. The company's activities will likely contribute to economic growth, but they'll also probably disturb or degrade some ecosystems. So do we let the company do the thing? You guessed it, businesses and governments almost always choose to prioritize economic growth over protecting biodiversity. Oh, and there's usually some environmental racism thrown in there for good measure. The third main issue I see with the UN's goals is that a lot of them aren't backed up with science. Like, most ecologists would probably agree with the basic idea of each of the goals and with the overarching theme of protecting biodiversity, but researchers haven't come to definitive conclusions on a lot of specifics yet. More research needs to be done, and fast, if we want to be able to understand the effects we're having and figure out how to mitigate them while we still have biodiverse ecosystems to protect. I don't mean for any of this to be depressing. I just want to break down the UN's biodiversity goals so that we understand where we are and what we need to do to keep making progress forward. So let's take a look. The first 4 Aichi targets address Goal A. Target number 1 says, people need to be aware. Who? What people? How will this be measured? And how many people will it take for this to be considered a success? Also, research has shown time and again that awareness does not lead to behavioral changes or action. So somebody on this committee was probably still working with the deficit model. Target number 2 wants biodiversity, sustainable resource use, and poverty reduction to be incorporated into every level of government by 2020 at the latest. But seriously, this is a huge ask. Basically, you want biodiversity to be incorporated into everything, which is great. But as we can see here in the USA and the fight over the Green New Deal, this is way easier said than done. And other countries aren't making a lot of progress on this one either. I am so here for the huge systematic change, but unfortunately, human systems don't tend to work that way. Target number 3 wants subsidies and incentives to be shifted from biodiversity harming activities to biodiversity protecting activities. But who decides which subsidies are harming biodiversity? And how do we design and implement biodiversity-friendly subsidies? And how do we choose between biodiversity and economic stability for certain business sectors when considering which subsidies to keep and which to discard? And target number 4 reinforces the need for systematic implementation of sustainable resource use. But what are safe ecological limits of natural resource use? Even ecological researchers don't know. That's because ecology is a complicated science. Ecosystems are complex machines with a billion moving parts. Also, the ecosystems we're trying to study are already being impacted by people, so it's very difficult for us to know what they were like beforehand, and if returning to those states is even a realistic goal. The next 6 targets address Goal B. I like target number 5, at least on the face of it, but how do we measure degradation? That's actually one of the ideas I've been pursuing in my research, but that means we don't have a very good idea of it right now. Also, I have a feeling that fragmentation isn't going to get better, at least not at a large scale. There are just so many people who need to use land space for so many things. Target number 6 is about protecting our aquatic food resources, but wow, all? Good luck with that. Again, it's very difficult for people to work on these science-reliant goals when the science hasn't even been done yet. Researchers are still trying to figure out how fish farms affect wild populations, and there are so many terrestrial things that can wind up affecting aquatic systems that this goal is basically impossible to fully reach. Target number 7 is only 15 words long, so you think it'd be pretty simple, but it might actually be the most complicated goal so far. Once again, we just don't know what sustainable management looks like for all agricultural, aquacultural, and forestry systems. Different people have different ideas, and no one solution may be entirely correct. Besides, most of those systems are under private management, so achieving 100% sustainability would require a lot of government regulation. Target number 8 wants us to get pollution under control. It's nice that this one doesn't expect us to get it all the way to 0, because that's probably not possible. But I feel like I sound like a broken record when I say that we just don't have a great idea of what levels of each kind of pollution would not be detrimental to ecosystem function and biodiversity. Target number 9 wants us to get invasive species under control. I did a quick search on Google Scholar, and it looks like there are publications mentioning invasive species going back into the early 1800s at least, so this is definitely not a new problem. That also probably means that we're not going to get to 100% on this target either, because every species that winds up becoming invasive has its own unique characteristics that make management difficult. And target number 10 wants us to minimize harmful effects to coral reefs and other fragile ecosystems. Oh, wait, hold on. Is that a typo, or did we just zoom right by that one? Either way, the ocean is an incredibly complex system, so I don't see this one being solved anytime soon. The next 3 targets address Goal C. Target number 11 finally gives us some specifics. It states that 17% of the land and 10% of the marine areas on Earth should be protected. But the Scientific American article I've linked below reviews a study showing that not only have we not reached the goal amounts of protected land yet, but that much of the land that is currently protected is at risk or under pressure. Just because we label an area as protected or conserved doesn't mean it stays that way. Target number 12 wants us to cease the decline and extinction of threatened animals. Oh, Target 12, I wish I had your optimism. But yeah, species extinction is a tricky thing. We've definitely stopped it from happening before, and we've even re-established populations of species that had gone extinct in the wild, but those efforts were incredibly expensive and difficult, and species will continue going extinct as long as we continue degrading and fragmenting habitats, and many of those that do go extinct will be ones we never knew existed. Target number 13 is interesting because it addresses biodiversity from the genetic perspective and includes domestic species. Monoculture and other conventional agricultural practices have caused livestock and crop species to become more and more inbred, leading to lower genetic diversity. Diversity in a species' genetics enables the species to bounce back from things like disease and adapt to things like pollution and climate change, so it's an important part of protecting biodiversity and our food supply. The next 3 targets address Goal D. Target number 14 talks about ecosystem services and the need for us to protect and restore the ecosystems that provide us with those services. First of all, as far as researchers know, basically every ecosystem on Earth provides us with some sort of service. And secondly, we just don't know everything about what benefits we might receive from intact ecosystems. Coupled with that, we are really struggling to figure out how to restore degraded ecosystems, so that's another level of challenge on top of that one. Target number 15 talks about restoration again, this time in the context of carbon sequestration, I'm assuming with an eye toward mitigating climate change. So here's the thing. I am fascinated by ecosystem restoration efforts, and some of my research has been focused on ecosystem restoration. But it is a young discipline with a lot of really complicated issues, so it's really not a good idea to be reliant on ecosystem restoration to fix these biodiversity problems. Target number 16 deals with a very specific set of rules, the Nagoya Protocol. If you'd like to learn more about it, I've put a link to the webpage for the protocol down in the description. The last 4 targets address Goal E. Target number 17 wants each country involved in the UN agreement to have incorporated these biodiversity goals into its governmental structure. Rewind to the view of that map if you're curious how we're doing on this one. Target number 18 is the first time we see explicit mention of indigenous peoples and how their cultures interact with governments and with natural resources. However, it doesn't take a whole lot of searching online to see we are unfortunately far from meeting this goal. Target number 19 directly addresses scientific research on biodiversity. However, the wording is so vague that I can say we've definitely crushed this one. That's because it's basically just asking us to expand and share knowledge about biodiversity. I know tons of people who have been and will continue to work on this kind of research. It's just unfortunate that we can't do it faster so that the rest of these 20 goals would have more science backing them up. And last but not least, target number 20 says that all of the UN participants in the agreement need to pay up so that the Convention on Biological Diversity can do its job, because none of this happens without financial investment. So yeah, 6 pages of script later, and it still feels like this is one 10-year challenge we will not have completed as we hit 2020. But like I said before, we haven't failed because it's not like we haven't been working on it. But biodiversity, conservation, ecosystem services, respect for indigenous peoples, and environmental racism aren't concepts that can easily be summed up in a list of 20 targets, or 5 goals, or 3 objectives. It's going to take a lot of work. On the bright side, these goals exist, which means that 10 years ago, people already thought it was worth working to protect the biodiversity and natural resources of our planet. So we should use our hope and energy to do what we can to help humanity complete the UN Convention on Biological Diversity's 10-year challenge, even if it takes us a little longer than a decade. Which of the 20 Aichi targets is your favorite? Which of the targets surprised you the most? I'd love to hear your thoughts down in the comments. If you liked this video, don't forget to like it. If you didn't like this video, please share it with someone who would. And if you'd like to support the Roving Naturalist, remember to hit the subscribe button and the bell notification icon. Then go check out my Patreon page. You can also follow me on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. If you're a big fan of biodiversity, you should check out the highly biodiverse continent of Arda in my science-themed Dungeons & Dragons game, Nature Check. We play twice a month on Twitch and Periscope, and you can follow us on Twitter for the game schedule. And as always, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.